France, the early 1700s, a royal ball. Many nobles dance to the opulent soundtrack of the court. Among them, you can spot the occasional man who's thirsty for something other than wine, trying his luck out with the ladies. Three such men in particular were all hawking around the same young bachelorette, but while they were busy working their gentlemanly charms on her all night, they noticed someone else was already tongue deep in their beloved's throat. Fist clenched, the three approach, only to find that was no man stealing their prize. They were upstaged by a woman in men's clothing. It didn't matter. Their blood was already boiling with rage, their heads swimming in wine. They want to take it outside. Their female opponent surprisingly accepts their challenge, no hesitation. So the four of them leave the warm glow of torches and candles for cold starlight. They find a nice secluded spot and draw their swords. It's over before it even begins. She's the last one standing. Alright, let's take it from the top and figure out how this lady became such a womanizer and where she learned crowd control. But before that, I heard this rumor. You, dear viewer, have this idea in the back of your mind that you keep wanting to turn into a video, but you just can't find the time. I'm not gonna lie, editing is hard, but here's a little secret. You don't have to. You know how you can ask ChatGPT to write you anything? Well, there's an AI service that does the same thing for your videos. With Pictory AI, you can simply drag and drop any scripts, articles, or even your own assets right into the application and let it do all the boring work for you. It lets you mix and match what it generates with voiceovers, clips, and images you bring in, and it can even translate your text into edits. So if you want to give this whole video thing a shot but you just can't find the time, why not check out Pictory with the affiliate link in the description. Who knows, you might pop off and start a new chapter in your story. Now, let's return to hers. This story takes place way back in a time that wasn't particularly, nice to women. I'm sure you've all heard stories of the times women couldn't vote or wear pants, but today's queen was born way before that. Look at it this way, it was a time where being born with ovaries meant you were sort of like a family pet. In the best of scenarios, worst case, you'd get sold around like a sack of potatoes or barbecued in the city square. Not great. So, for the longest time, women basically had to deal with this catch-22 kind of choice. You keep your head down and your mouth shut, and you'll get a decently comfortable life at the cost of your dignity. Or you could spend most of your life screaming and shouting for equality. Option 2, of course, comes with a caveat. Everyone's gonna call you crazy and keep their distance. Your friends and family too. No, especially your friends and family. Plus, even if you do make a change, it's gonna be really small and no one's gonna remember you for it. Now, what if I told you there was an option 3? Once upon a blue moon, a person of a different caliber is born. A person to whom it doesn't matter what society's rules say life should be. She does what she pleases and takes what she wants and leaves behind stories so wild no one's gonna believe it. But also, no one's gonna forget her. Enter Julie Emily Daubeny, aka Mademoiselle Maupin, aka Mrs. Steals Your Girl and Breaks Your Ribs. A lady unlike the rest who lived life on the edge and left behind many broken hearts and bones. And she might have committed a little arson that one time, but we'll get there. Surprisingly, no literal body count, or at least none that we know of. A lot of her smaller crimes against society wouldn't get much more than a head turn or maybe a frown nowadays. But people didn't take too kindly to all things queer back in the early 70s. The 1670s in a France that looked very much like this. a girl was born at the stables. No, not like Jesus. We're not talking about some ramshackle barn full of hay and horse pies. We're talking about the royal stables. It was right across from the Palace of Versailles, and it's where the king kept all his good horses for races and parades. Just imagine a giant horseback riding range with a couple of rich boys racing across, while thousands of blacksmiths and other, horse technicians lived in the houses all around. Sounds like a cool enough place to visit, sure, but who would actually live there? Well, aside from the plebs, the place needed actual management, and that's what Julie's father, Gaston, did. No, not that Gaston, but close enough. Gaston was secretary to the horsemaster, Count d'Armagnac, the guy who owned the entire place. And aside from handling the Count's mail, Julie's dad was also an accomplished fencer, so they put him in charge of teaching all the spoiled brats whose dads were anyone at the court how to stab people. And since Gaston was already an instructor, he decided Julie should go to school with the boys, since that would give her the best education anyone could hope for. Plus, it meant he could keep an eye on her, or so he thought. This is the first of many really funny mistakes people make with Julie. From here on out in the story, just remember, whenever someone thinks they're about to put her down, it completely backfires in hysterical ways. Spoilers, I know, but it's too ironic not to point out, so please pay attention. But how, you might ask, does giving a girl all the essential education she needs, plus all the fun stuff like horse riding and sword fighting, end up as a mistake? Well, think of it this way. You put her in a class with the boys. That's how. So, Julie and her classmates are now well educated in all the necessities, but they're also excelling at the disciplines of drinking, gambling, and getting up to no good in general. Standard stuff for a European 12-year-old, I know, but you gotta remember, Julie's not only smart, but also a badass tomboy. And a time has to come where she's old enough to realize she's not gonna catch cooties if she sits next to her classmates. And sure enough, a time came. A time when all her classmates started growing hair in unusual places, and they all decided they'd really like to spend some more time sparring with her, but without any clothes on. Now, Gaston, being not only the boys' fencing instructor, but more importantly, Julie's dad, was the one to stomp his foot down and do something about it. He gladly defended his daughter's honor by dueling every suitor who lined up until they all went home with their tails and other bits limply between their legs. As you might imagine, Julie was fed up with all the boys she brought to the yard running away because of her dad. So instead of boys, she went straight to a real man, a man powerful enough Gaston wouldn't dare open his mouth to complain about it, let alone raise his sword to challenge him. Yeah, that's right, at the tender age of just 14. Tired of all the guys getting scared off, Julie starts a relationship with the 40-year-old Count, aka Gaston's boss, aka the guy who runs the entire place. Huh, guess you can teach a girl to parry swords. You can personally fend off all her suitors, but you can't stop her from catching a couple of thrusts from your boss. As angry as Gaston had to be about the whole situation, it's his boss, so he has to kiss the master's ring while his daughter is kissing something else. Now, if hearing this makes you feel angry, or dare I say, even icky, that's good. No, you're good. That's normal. People back then were angry too. although not for the same reasons you might imagine. The Count was already a married man with 14 legitimate children with his actual wife. That's the same number as Julie's age, and he probably had a couple extras off the books. But that kind of relationship wasn't really uncommon back then. No, the real issue people had with the whole affair was that Julie herself wasn't married. Yeah, that kind of logic absolutely short-circuits my 21st century brain too. But for the sake of the story, just try to imagine a world where cheating on your spouse with a teenager is a-okay as long as that teenager is already married. Not to you, just married in general. So, naturally, Julie had to get a ring around her finger ASAP. But who's gonna be her lucky guy? One of her classmates? Perhaps a wealthy acquaintance of Gaston's? We can't say for sure who the matchmaker was. It could have been her dad's idea or the Count's, but whoever made the choice, he picked a shy accountant named Maupin to marry Julie. And that's about all the description I'm gonna give you on Maupin, because as far as history is concerned, he's just a footnote in her story, and that should give you a good enough idea of the kind of man he was, or rather failed to be. If the whole thing was Gaston's idea, he probably imagined a quiet and reserved man would finally get his Julie to settle down and behave more ladylike. If the Count was behind it, he probably saw Maupin as someone you could step all over, making it easier to continue sleeping with his wife. Whichever of the two people Julie was calling daddy at the time came up with this idea, it's another one of those terrible miscalculations, and it backfired spectacularly. The Count scenario seems more likely to me, because before the ink was even dry on the marriage certificate, the Count shipped off Julie's new husband to collect taxes in the south of France. You know, the backwater part of France, where houses are miles apart. Everyone talks funny, even by French standards, and the population is so uneducated, you'd have better luck explaining their tax situation to the family cow. Of course, Maupin did as he was told, and with him out of the picture, the Count and Julie could spend the honeymoon together with no one around to tell them no. They were safe from public outcry or any disgruntled spouses. And it was just like a honeymoon, because it only lasted like 2 months. No, Maupin didn't come back to recover his wife. Julie just met someone who reminded her that she had a passion for swords, which are not made of meat. Enter Serranes, a traveling fencing aficionado and Julie's new flame. If this was some sort of Hollywood drama or rom-com, you'd expect some will they, won't they, or maybe Team Count versus Team Serranes. But fortunately, this was real life, and the plot was a lot cooler. Serranes just dueled the guy, which was illegal, to the death, which was double illegal, and he did it in Paris, which doesn't exactly make it triple illegal, but greatly raises your chances of getting caught, especially when the Lieutenant General of Police is hot on your trails. So, how do two lovebirds in the late Middle Ages escape from a family, a pay daddy, and the law? Well, Julie and Serranes buckled up their trousers and booked it out of Paris with a 5-star wanted level. Only problem was, they didn't have a penny to their name. But this was good for Julie. Sure, she might have had it easier at the stables, but she didn't really own anything. Everything was a gift from the man whose shadow she lived under, and everything came with a string attached. Now she was finally free and independent. Plus, she had Serranes, and the two made quite a pair. They went from tavern to tavern across the French countryside, putting putting on fencing shows, and whether or not they got to eat was up to how cool they looked with their swords. Good thing is, they were, both of them, really impressive. Serranis was basically a master, and I skipped over this part earlier, but Julie herself was an absolute menace with the blade. And I don't mean she was good for a girl, I mean she could put grown men to shame, even soldiers, but we'll get there. To make their little show on wheels, or rather hooves, stand out more, Julie would also bring out her singing talents, which made spectators' jaws drop, since her voice revealed this badass sword fighter in men's trousers was in fact a woman. Only one problem with all of it: a very loud and obnoxious part of her male audience started heckling and accusing Julie of only pretending to be a woman. This wasn't very good, since her being a lady was the one thing setting their show apart from so many other performances. Now, of course, Julie didn't let this drag her down, since she had a very simple solution. She just tore open her blouse and flashed everyone in the crowd. This just stands to prove that tits or GTFO wasn't something the early internet just came up with, but instead a long-running tradition from the earliest points in recorded history. But Julie's arsenal against the haters went beyond just giving her fun bags a little air to breathe. That was just her being nice. But some people didn't deserve her being nice, so whenever a particularly annoying whiner wouldn't shut up, she showed them her sword moves were more than an act. I mean, hell, if your dad teaches you how to stab dudes and you practice with your boyfriend on the daily, might as well put it to good use. Sure, personal duels were still very much illegal in France, but what are the losers gonna do? Cry about how they got absolutely demolished by a woman? And demolished they got. Maybe because they really annoyed her, maybe because she was used to much tougher opponents. Julie went hard. Really hard. A little too hard sometimes. Like that one time she stabbed a soldier right to the shoulder to shut him up. You don't have to feel bad for him though. Julie already did. So, to make things even, she visited his recovery bed and let him stab her a couple of times in return. Only not with a sword. And not in the shoulder. And hey, they even turned it into an on and off situationship afterwards. Pretty based, but considering how high her total body count is about to climb, Soldier Boy was just the beginning. And speaking of Julie's first, she hadn't even tried her luck out with the ladies yet. Plus, Serranis was just about reaching that couple of months point where Julie gets bored and starts looking for new adventures. But who should be the target of her affections next? Well, sure enough, during one of their following shows, Julie spots a pretty face in the audience. It was a young country girl, much like herself, except without all the badassery or wild adventures or, well, anything that made Julie. A brief reminder, we are still talking 1600s France here. Things like cross-dressing or same-sex relationships, well, they weren't exactly outlawed, because they couldn't be, since the king's brother was openly into both. But just because it wasn't illegal didn't make it any easier for the average dirt farmer back then to stomach, especially since they'd been raised on a steady diet of Bible thumping and hellfire. Julie and others in the performing arts got away with it since, well, she was a fugitive from the law, more or less, and it was pretty much expected for entertainers to be strange or queer in one way or another. It just came with the territory. Unfortunately, things weren't as straightforward for her new girlfriend. As soon as her parents found out, they shipped her off to a coven. That's just what you did back then when your daughter had something wrong with her. Or something happened to her. You sent her to an all-female monastery, which was a bit like a gay conversion camp in the 90s, except without any supervision or, you know, human rights. But Julie wasn't about to let her first blossoming girl love slip between her fingers, so naturally she put on nun's clothing, which was probably really weird for someone used to pants, took her churchly vows, and followed her new girlfriend into the coven. She had to, of course, leave behind Saranes and their whole act they did together, but it was worth reuniting with her new love. Now, to break out. You can imagine security wasn't exactly tight around the 17th century monastery, and neither was the fire code. The plan was simple. Julie stole a recently deceased nun's body, stashed it in her girlfriend's bed, then set the whole place on fire. Then the two lovebirds ran away into the night, leaving the other nuns to deal with their flames, which just kinda threatened to consume the entire building. Once more, Julie is fleeing the law, gallivanting through the countryside, but this time with a female sidekick. They kept this up for about 2 months until her girlfriend realized Julie was a bit more unhinged than she'd signed up for, so she went back home to her parents. I mean, with red flags so obvious, it's actually a miracle Julie could keep the relationship going for that long. It just stands to show what an insanely charismatic person she must have been. Needless to say, as soon as the girl returned to mommy and daddy after being presumably dead, they were a little more shocked than she was. So they immediately run to a judge to open up a legal case against Julie, and the whole story was so crazy, the judge immediately sentences Julie to be burned alive on the spot. Except, one major detail about this trial is that Julie wasn't actually there. On the one hand, this really worked out in her favor since she wasn't there for her punishment. But on the other, what do you think was going through the judge's mind when he hears a case of grave robbery, arson, as well as kidnapping a teenage nun? Just like Julie's audience at her shows, the judge decided there's no way any woman could be behind all of it. So, assuming a man was responsible, he passed the harshest sentence he could think of. Julie was now set to be burned alive as soon as someone catches her. And, oh, would you look at the time? Well, if it isn't another one of those people try to put Julie down only to fail miserably moments. But how? Just how do you escape a death warrant? I mean, Julie had really done it this time. Not only were her crimes truly heinous, when taken out of context and explained by a pair of very angry parents, but her crimes were against the church, which back then had a little more say in what went on in the world. Back then, the church basically could, and did on some occasions, dethrone kings and start wars. And unlike kings and queens, church has no borders, baby. If you really make them mad, there's nowhere left to hide in the whole of Europe. So at this point, Julie has been a runaway for about 6 months. She's been sentenced to death, and she's single. Oh, that's right. It's about time for her to start another months-long romantic fling, isn't it? And she wound up in bed with the acclaimed opera singer Gabriel Vincent Thévenard. Funny thing about their little romance, Gabriel was Julie's perfect escape. What do you do when one of the most powerful organizations in the country is out to get you? Well, you ask for help from the other most powerful organization in the country, of course. And in Julie's case, that just so happens to be the French crown. No, unfortunately, she didn't seduce the king. At least as far as we know. You see, Gabriel got Julie roles into his operas, and as soon as he got himself approved for the Paris Opera, he had one condition for bringing his talents to the capital. Julie had to come with And as it turned out, King Louis happened to be a big fan of Julie's, which is great because the way political power worked in France was split down the middle, half to the king and crown, the other half to the church, and they were constantly at each other's throats. But this being the age of enlightenment and all, instead of going scorched earth on each other, they fought with subtle jabs. Of course, they couldn't do so directly, since that would be a little too on the nose. So King Louis's favorite way of insulting the church was to sponsor the arts. He fills artists' pockets, and they put anti-church propaganda in their plays and songs. Everyone goes home happy, and hey, it's not even a commission if you squint for long enough. And Julie was just what King Louis would be looking for. A bisexual cross-dressing actress who's insanely charismatic and committed terrible, but ultimately harmless crimes against the church. And to top it all off, her very way of existing just goes against everything the church believes a woman should be and act like. You couldn't ask for a better combo in your anti-church propagandists. So, of course, King Louis was more than happy to wipe Julie's rap sheet clean. With all of her crimes pardoned, she got accepted into the Versailles theater group. This was her big break. She wouldn't have to live her best years as a wandering vagabond. She's safe from the clutches of the law, and instead of a small crowd of country bumpkins, she'd be performing in front of the French elite at one of the most prestigious opera houses in the world. The professional transition wasn't even that hard. She was already trained in the performing arts. She did do a lot of singing on her way here, and her natural charisma was a given. She lost a couple of points for not being able to read sheet music, because like every normal person, she just reads tabs. But she made up for it by remembering her lines remarkably fast, and often doing improv and interacting with the crowds, going under the stage name Mademoiselle Maupin, because that was technically her legal name. Her debut role was as the goddess Athena, and I couldn't think of a better position for someone like her. Unless you're a theater kid, you might be a little bummed out to hear this crazy swordswoman ended up with a boring acting career. But you gotta remember, this was the Renaissance. Opera singers were their rock stars, and the theater stage was their walk-in or Burning Man. And live like a rock star, Julie did, along with all of her new actor friends. Half of the crew she slept with, reportedly. The other she had very heated and public beef with. And of course, gender wasn't a deciding factor on who was in which camp. And with wild antics like that, the rumor mill spun like crazy, and spectators loved Julie even more. Maybe there weren't any tabloids back then, but celebrity gossip and parasocial relationships were already well and alive. And Julie had become everyone's favorite new obsession with her very genuine and often a bit deranged performances. And just because she left her sword-swinging days behind, don't think for 1 second that she didn't get into fights anymore. There was this tenor guy, Goulart Dumesny, which I'm just gonna be calling Gal the incel. See, Gal had a bad habit of insulting his female co-stars, probably out of romantic frustration, and Julie happened to catch him one time while he was making fun of another actress. Gal was such a gentleman, he'd already tried to put Julie down because out of the entire cast, he's the one she refused to sleep with. Gee, I wonder why. Needless to say, her co-workers had to stop Julie from walloping the little insect on the spot and causing a bloodbath backstage. But that was backstage, and her co-workers weren't around after hours. They weren't there in the dark alley where Julie stalked Gal to, where she beat him bloody with a cane, then thieved his prized pocket watch and smokes. Of course, the next day, everyone's asking Gal why he's all bloody and bruised and where his Rolex went, to which our gentleman starts narrating his awesome tale of bravery fending off a gang of robbers, but sadly losing his pocket watch in in the process. Naturally, that's when Julie makes her entrance and gives him back all the stuff she stole from him, right in front of everyone, of course, so the whole dressing room knows just what a fat, creepy liar Gal is. It most likely didn't come as a surprise to, well, most of them, but I'm sure Gal had that beating coming for a while. But no one before Julie had the lady balls to deliver it. And as you'd expect, no one's gonna charge Julie over assaulting the insufferable prick anyway, so they got away scot-free once again. But Julie's next victory wouldn't have the same clear-cut moral superiority, and it wouldn't happen in a dark alley either. Her next brawl was actually gonna bring her some honest-to-Jiminy lasting consequences. As I've said, Julie was blowing up in her acting career, so our girl gets herself an invite to the royal ball. Obviously, Julie walks in dressed in men's clothing, then proceeds to rizz up all the ladies. Now remember, this is an event organized by the crown, and celebs like her are just invited because everyone knows their face, so most of their other attendants are nobles who, just like the dirt poor peasantry, aren't all that fond of the gay stuff. Maybe some of them would be okay with it, or even be into it, but they definitely didn't have the lady balls to show it in public. Not everyone's the king's brother, so most of the women Julie hits up offer her a dance and a polite no thank you. Most of them, but not one particular young lady who was already being courted by 3 separate guys. You know this from the beginning of the video. While the 3 dudes were busy fighting over this chick, Julie had no trouble swapping spit with her right in front of him, as well as in front of everyone else at the ball. Far from the most insane stunt she pulled, this was really bad for optics. Again, while girl love wasn't exactly banned, it was one of those fringe things people preferred hearing about in gossip stories and stage plays, not something that happens right in front of their eyes. Also, stealing someone else's girl was something pretty run-of-the-mill at the court, but snatching an unmarried woman from 3 men who just wasted the whole night, maybe even longer, trying to get her hand, that was just scandalous. Foaming at the mouth, the 3 rejects approach and demand satisfaction. That's all speak for, let's take it outside, 1v1 me bro. Except it wasn't 1v1, it was 3 against Julie. All 3 of them pounce on her at once, and you know how this ends. They get absolutely obliterated. Yep, Julie really owned those men's trousers she was wearing. And you have to remember, even if these were pampered rich boys, they would have still gone through some of the best fencing lessons money can buy, and they were drunk on adrenaline and rage at the time. After laying the law for her wannabe romantic rivals, Julie just saunters back up to the ball like nothing happened. Just one problem. Remember how I said dueling was illegal? Yeah, it still was. One of the most important laws for the crown, in fact. No, don't worry, it wasn't to protect the citizens or anything. You see, under the feudal system, the king's subjects, that means everyone, were supposed to surrender their ability for violence to the king, and by extension his army and law officers. You dare not stab your neighbor because it was wrong. You didn't do it because only the king or one of his cronies had the right to decide your neighbor needed a little knifey knife. Breaking that rule very publicly was not something you got away with, no matter how important you were. And Julie wasn't really that important to begin with. She just got herself some very influential protectors, but none of those protectors could save her from the king's justice. She messed with the church before, then ran to the king. Now she just messed with the king and ran right back to his ball. Not the brightest of moves. Now what do you think Julie does when she's caught with her hand in the royal cookie jar? Why, she gets away with it, of course. Yep, either King Louis or his brother found the whole story really funny. A woman cucks 3 guys, then embarrasses them all in a single duel was something you just couldn't even come up with. To have it happen at your own private party was kinda like a joke come to life. Plus, the dueling law technically applied to men, and as most of her co-workers could confirm after up close and in-depth analysis, notice, Julie was no man. Whatever the reason, Julie was free to dance and drink the night away. Problem is, she had a little more than a hangover to deal with the next day. She kinda got the Renaissance equivalent of getting ratioed on Twitter, so she escaped to Belgium until the heat died down a bit. While on this little sabbatical, she got up to her usual shenanigans, got into a relationship with the Elector of Bavaria, basically low-key royalty, killed it on the Belgian stage, got into a couple of minor scuffles, and all in all, left the Belgians too shocked to forget her. This short side story ended when she went a little too hard during a show and finally got stabbed. No, don't worry, she didn't actually meet anyone who could outsword her. The only way a dagger was going through her was if she did it herself. And that's exactly what happened. It's not like this was the first time she got a little too real on stage. She almost bit another actor's face off before, so it's only fair she stabs herself for dramatic effect too. I can't imagine the crowd's faces when they realized the profuse bleeding was not part of the script. But we know for sure her boyfriend, the Elector of Bavaria, didn't take it too well. As soon as he found out his lover almost game-ended herself on purpose, he must have realized all those rumors he was hearing about her had some truth behind them. The guy was so freaked out, he gave her 40,000 francs to go away, which she did right after throwing the money right back in his stupid face. That was an entire fortune. Julie just flushed down the latrine to prove a point. And I say, good for her. Hey, you can't handle her at her craziest. Why the hell were you dating in the first place? The whole experience turned Belgium into a bad mood, so Julie moved back to France since her timeout expired. She had no trouble picking up where she left off with her acting and public freakouts. Her life continued to be just as wild, but we have to sit here all day to go through all the things Julie supposedly got up to. What we mostly know for sure is that around the time the new century, the 1700s, rolled around, she finally got experimental enough to actually sleep with her honest-to-God real husband she was married to. Remember? The guy she got the name Maupin from? It's alright if you don't, because by 1703, Julie finally found her OTP, La Marquise de Florensac, a woman many described as the most beautiful in the whole of France. This time, to everyone's surprise, it actually seemed like Julie would settle down. By all accounts, the two made a perfect hell couple, and for once, the honeymoon period was still going strong even after 2 whole years together. But just when everyone was convinced the impossible had happened and Julie found her happy ever after, fate reared its ugly head and struck La Marquise with a fatal fever. This wasn't the first time Julie was heartbroken. In fact, it happened plenty, and her outbursts were, well, very Julie. A lot of acting out and threats of unaliving herself or others, but this time she was actually devastated enough to retire. She didn't just leave her job at the opera, but pretty much retired from her very public persona entirely and lived in isolation, or at least far away enough that nobody knows what really happened to her. One famous account tells us she became a nun. Again, and died at a ripe old age of 33. Just like Jesus. There's nothing to actually back it up, so you can make up any headcanon you want about the end of her life, and your version is gonna be just as real as the most popular account. But I mean, if she did actually retire at a monastery, the staff must have had to work shifts taking her first confession, because that was already one hell of a lifetime, and I think it was more than enough. There was a lot to Julie or Madame Maupin's life. A lot of it I just summarized or didn't even mention because, just like the epilogue, for most of it, we don't actually know which version of events is true. We don't know which of her adventures were actually hers and which were actually ripped out of someone else's life. Some of the stories have to be completely made up. What we know for sure is that she existed and she lived outrageously enough that she made making it into the history books. Plus, all of her stories are tied together by the same themes, and all of them revolve around Julie being one of, if not the most, liberated people to ever be alive. Now, most of what she allegedly did, you probably wouldn't try nowadays for legal reasons. But if there's anything to take away from her is that you should never let the life you're born into stop you from doing what you want. If you belong to a marginalized or underprivileged group, just own it. Carve your own path. Screw the haters. And remember, just like the inventors of jazz, rock and roll, and cinema, people who got pushed to the edge of society are also the people on the cutting edge of everything new. They're crowded out of all the traditional, boring jobs, so they've got no choice but to build their own niche where they're in charge. I'll do my best to keep bringing you stories of remarkable and strange people from all around the world and all throughout history. You just make sure to stay subscribed.